So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to simplify a radical or put it in simplest terms or reduce a radical, however it says. You're used to hearing this when it comes to fractions, but you can also reduce a radical instead of approximating a square root. So sometimes you'll be given, especially when we're dealing with Pythagorean theorem, and you have to find the length of a missing side, because to do the opposite of squaring, you take the square root. So oftentimes when using the Pythagorean theorem to figure out a side of a right triangle, you will have to take the square root of a number. So let's take a square root of a number, 224. Now, we could approximate this, but instead the directions say put it in simplest form or reduce the radical. My simplest would just be to type it into a calculator and hit the enter button and it'll reduce it for you. However, sometimes there are non-calculator allowed parts. So you look at the number on the inside and you figure out if you can multiply a perfect square by anything to get that. And you try to find the largest perfect square you can. So in this case, I know that if I multiply 16 by 14, 16 being a perfect square, we can get this number. We'll break this into the square root of 16 times the square root of 14, because I know 16 times 14 is 224. Therefore, the square root of 16 and the square root of 14 equals the square root of 224. Now here, this is a perfect square. So I'm going to go ahead and solve this portion and still multiply it by the square root of 14. Now, most of the time, you're not going to figure out that 16 and times 14 equals 224. Typically, you're going to look for, okay, I normally start with 9 or 4 are kind of my go-tos. So in this one, when you had the square root of 224, and I noticed in there, I said, oh, you know what? 4 does go into 224. So I'm going to pull out the square root of 4 times, now 224 divided by 4 is 56. But then I can break this down even further. 4 also goes into 56. So I have the square root of 4 times, and let's break this down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 14. Now solve both of these. So 2 times 2 times the square root of 14, and we get 4 times the square root of 14. So we end up with the same answer. You're going to So you're going to look for the largest perfect square factor of the number in the radical, okay? So these are 2 factors that make up the 224. 16 is the largest perfect square, okay? But don't worry if you don't get the largest perfect square and you just find a factor that is a perfect square, it just takes you another extra step to get to the fully reduced form. So let's go ahead and try another one. So let's try the square root of 252. If I were going to use the largest perfect square factor, so 2 factors for this are 36 and 7. If I multiply 36 by 7, I get this. So I'm going to go ahead and write the square root of 36 times the square root of 7. 36 is a perfect square, so the square root of 36 is just 6. So 6 times the square root of 7. Without a calculator, are you really going to figure out that 36 times 7 is 252? If I were doing this without a calculator, let's pull out the 4. So you realize that 4 is a factor, and 4 times 63 is 252. But 63, well, that's 7 times 9. And 9's a perfect square, so 4 times 9 times 7 right, all equal 252. So the square root of 252 equals the square root of 4 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 7. Now these are perfect squares, so you can solve the square root of 4 to be 2, the square root of 9 is 3, and then square root of 7, you just have to approximate that. 2 times 3 is 6, so 6 times the square root of 7. It's not easy. It takes a long time. It is also really, really advantageous if you have your perfect squares memorized. So at the beginning of the year, when I said you have to have these perfect squares memorized and keep them memorized, I wasn't kidding. Go back to Quizlet, practice with those flashcards. If you didn't make your own flashcards, the electronic flashcards are there for you. On these pullouts, go ahead and go step by step, write out your steps as to how to do this, okay? And you might also want to put the perfect squares. Just start listing them, right? All right, thank you.